probably don't relish reading 20 pages on SEND funding mechanisms, but they are important to understand, so let's have a look at them together. You don't have to answer every question in this section, but some parts do raise major red flags. One of the biggest concerns is that despite all the promises about consistency and fairness, so many decisions about what children receive will be based on local decision making rather than the legal rights that they have now. They say they will rebalance funding so that mainstream settings receive more funding for SEND in their core budgets, and there will be a new system of pooled funding and local SEND groups of schools. They want to move away from funding tied to individual children through their EHCPs to more SEND funding going straight to groups of schools to assign as needed. They want to see schools working together and resources pooled across areas sharing responsibility for SEND provision between them. They even say on page 84, settings will be able to decide on the best way to meet needs thanks to these funding changes. And although they plan to have national inclusion standards, this is only described as guidance, not a new legal duty. Different areas will allocate and prioritise funding differently. As they do now, they'll have different levels of expertise and very different cultures and attitudes to inclusion. So while the reforms talk constantly about national consistency, the reality could actually become more variable between areas. That's especially true when more children would rely on unenforceable individual support plans than EHCPs. The consultation also repeatedly talks about rewarding inclusion in mainstream, which sounds lovely, but this only works if schools have enough capacity, resource, time, training and staff and all of that. This section often feels very idealistic about how all of this would actually work in practice. They reference their investments like the Inclusive Mainstream Fund, Experts at Hand, Early Intervention and the new SEND training. But the reform plans rely very heavily on those investments actually succeeding, despite there being no clear evidence yet scale of change is achievable within that funding or that this will reduce the need for EHCPs. So what happens when the funding falls short of what's needed or, despite their best efforts, some schools or areas just do not buy in as much as others? That risks widening inequity between families depending only on where they live and what their local area does. In this section, they reveal that one of the main aims of specialist provision packages is to create a fairer, more predictable cohort-based funding model. In plain English, they want to allocate funding based on category of need rather than individual needs. They say they will rebalance funding by moving a portion of funding currently distributed through local authorities from high needs budgets directly into mainstream core budgets. They dislike that the current system has a greater reliance on top-up funding in mainstream settings, with support increasingly bespoke to individual pupils, to fund the provision identified for individual children by professionals. This is one of the clearest examples in the whole consultation of individualised support being framed as the problem. They are unhappy that funding is tied to statutory assessments, which is delaying support and diverting staff time into bureaucracy. Notice that thorough assessment and statutory plans are repeatedly demonised and framed as unnecessary. I wonder what educational psychologists would make of this. They say money is currently allocated to education settings through EHCP top-ups, but in future more of it will go straight into schools and colleges' core budgets. In other words, once fewer children have the legal right to support, there'll be more money in the system because children will be getting less. Moving children off EHCPs doesn't save money unless you take provision away from them. Questions 34 to 37 sit at the end of a section called Accountability, which says there are clear consequences for local areas that do not meet high standards and outcomes. What are those consequences? All it says is they will consider installing a trust to take over the local authority's responsibilities on SEND where they fail. They say from this year we propose holding settings and trust to account on the use of their inclusion funding, and that they will place conditions on this funding to make sure it's used effectively. That's potentially positive, but only if the expectations for settings are actually achievable within the funding, and school staff that I've spoken to have been very clear that it's not. Question 30 asks how settings should be held accountable for how they spend this funding, which is at least one direct question on a proposal that everyone wants to see, so that's something we can answer, I guess. Even if there are meaningful consequences for when they fail, services under pressure will still prioritise delivering only what they are legally required to provide. We know this because it's the cause of the current SEND crisis and the growing number of EHCPs. When resources are insufficient, legally enforceable provision is the only way to keep children with SEND in education. And if you take that away from more children, what is actually going to happen to them? The proposals say all schools should become part of a SEND group and pool some of their inclusive mainstream funding. If you can see immediate issues with that, so could the government. Question 33 asks how disagreements within groups of schools should be resolved. They know that disagreement is inevitable and children will be caught in the middle of this. So for questions 30 to 36, you might want to think about risks of local variation, genuine accountability, the risks of pooled funding, whether inclusion funding will actually reach children who need it most, and whether reducing statutory individual rights while increasing reliance on local discretion risks making support even more inconsistent across the country than it is now. Do we really want a system where the support a child receives is so heavily connected to local decision making and culture? Up next, we will look at the proposals and sections that have no questions in preparation for the crucial final question of the consultation. There are so many that there might need to be 2 parts to that video. We'll see how it goes. You can find all the previous parts of this series on my page, or I have a YouTube playlist with all the videos in order. The link for that is in my bio. If you're finding these videos helpful, please do interact and share so they can reach as many people who need them as possible before the deadline on the 18th of May. And don't wait to start filling it in. Start now before we miss the chance to do it.